here today? Yes. All right. In Psalm chapter 84, David writes, he says, "It is better is one day in your courts, O Lord, than 1,000 elsewhere." Look at somebody around you and say, "I'm glad you're here. There's nowhere better to be." There's nowhere but. Hey, we are glad that you have joined us on this holiday weekend as we are going through our journey in the book of Acts. And if you've been with us for a while, you might recall some of what we've talked about, that the Apostle Paul has been on these missionary journeys where he was sent from the church of Antioch in Syria with this vision that he was chasing, something God wanted him to do. And he quickly found that really what God was calling him to be a part of was to connect people who were far away from religion and far away from God, and to show them how God really wanted to reconnect back together with them. Their journey was difficult, and it required tenacity and persistence, and yet it was fueled by the Holy Spirit rather than themselves. Early on in their journey, there was this debate about whether somebody who was far from God had to become super religious in order to connect back with God, or in essence, whether or not a Gentile had to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. And they decided, no, we want to reach everybody with grace. We're going to prioritize this amazing grace of our God, and we're not going to make it difficult for people to come to faith in who Jesus Christ is. They worked together as a team of people, and as they went about, they sometimes encountered these closed doors or these roadblocks to where they wanted to go, and God used that to redirect them to where He wanted them to go. Sometimes they encountered difficult situations and found that even in the midst of difficulty and hardship, there was power in worship, in praise, and in singing songs. Sometimes literally broke chains, and in our lives has the power to break the chains that sometimes Satan holds us back on. Certain accomplices would join them as they traveled and take the risk to be associated with Jesus and this gospel of truth that was being made available to others. If you brought a Bible with you this morning, it might look like papery like this or digital like this, but I'd love for you to get that Bible out right now. It has got a lot more important words than the things that come out of my mouth. So I want you to take that Bible, raise it up in the air, and say, "I got my Bible, PJ." That's awesome. I would love for you to turn in that Bible to Acts chapter 17, verse 16, and I'll give you a few minutes to turn to Acts 17 while I chat. If you remember last week, we left off in Acts. Paul was chased out of Berea by this Jewish mob from Thessalonica. And Paul has fled roughly 300 miles away to southern Greece in the city of Athens. And today we get to read about how Paul spent his time in Athens. And if you've been tracking with our journey so far, or if you're at all familiar with the Apostle Paul and his life, it probably comes as no surprise that he uses his time in Athens as an attempt to spread the gospel message of Jesus Christ, to convince others to put their faith and their trust and their hope in who Jesus was. The bottom line of the gospel and the whole Jesus thing, we might call it Christianity, this whole Jesus thing, the bottom line has always been about connecting people with God the Father. In Matthew 19, Jesus steps on the scene and he's calling his first disciples. And if you remember in Matthew 4:19, he says to his first disciples, and by extension to all of us who would ever trust in Jesus, he says, "Come and follow me, and I will send you out to fish for people." There's something about this journey with Jesus that from the very beginning, Jesus says, "Come follow me, and I will send you out." We're all in this sent out journey together. And he calls us to fish for people. This summer, our family decided to take up a new hobby, and we've been learning to catch actual fish, or trying to catch actual fish. And being new, we've been kind of hungry for information and tips, and we've pretty quickly discovered that there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of people that are willing to kind of share some of their tips and what they know, and especially online, there's all kinds of information that you can learn. And one of the things that I've learned is that fishing can be both very simple and very complex, and that knowing some kind of key information before you go out to the lake or go out to the river can really help you to be a little bit wiser, a little bit more of a wise fisherman. And speaking of wise fishermen, I was reading on Tuesday about a man who was getting stopped by the game warden. He was out at Maple Lake, and he was walking back to his car. He had a couple buckets full of fish, and the game warden came up to him and said, "Do you have a license for those fish?" And the man kind of looked at him for a moment, and he said, "No, sir, these are my pet fish." "Pet fish?" the warden replied. He said, "Oh, yes, sir. I bring these fish down here every night, and I let them swim around in the lake for a little while, and then I whistle, and they all jump back in the bucket, and I take them home." "That's a bunch of baloney. Fish can't do that," the warden says in disbelief. And the man kind of stops and looks at him for a second. He says, "Come on, I'll show you." And so the game warden's like, "All right, I have got to see this." And they walk down to the lake together, and the man dumps the buckets in there for a while, and they're both looking out over the lake, and a few minutes pass, and the warden looks over at him and he says, Well, what? Aren't you going to call him back?" "Call who back?" "The fish." "What fish?" Oh, being a wise fisherman can really increase your odds for success. And don't worry, our family has purchased our licenses, and we actually did get stopped more than a week ago and asked by somebody who was checking for them. But when it came to people, being a fisher of men and women, rather than literal fish, I think that the Apostle Paul might have been one of the wisest fishermen who ever lived. And this story that we get the chance to read in Acts chapter 17 this morning is one of his most famous fishing trips. And I think it serves to teach us some important things on our journey of being sent out by Jesus to fish for people. And so if you would read with me Acts chapter 17, and we're going to start at verse 16. It says this. It says, "While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols." Remember, Silas and Timothy are still back up in Berea. It says, "So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with Paul, and some of them asked him, 'What is this babbler trying to say?' Others remarked, 'He seems to be advocating for foreign gods.' And they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him into a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, 'May we know this new teaching that you are presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we'd like to know what they mean.' All of the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Then Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, 'People of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, "To an unknown God." So you're ignorant of the thing you worship, and this is what I want to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. He is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he's made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times and histories and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he really isn't far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we shouldn't think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. He has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He's given proof of this to everyone by raising him, Jesus, from the dead." When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, and others said, "We want to hear you more on this subject." At that, Paul left the council, and some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So Paul finds himself in one of the most prominent and influential cities of Hellenistic society and the Roman Empire. He finds himself in Athens, and most of us are still familiar with Athens. And it is kind of one of those cultural centers that really has a massive impact on the rest of the world. It's a pluralistic city. There's a pantheon of different gods that are worshipped, as well as a number of philosophers who really find no use for God or religion of any kind. It is a center of education, a center of culture, and a center of history. And what can we learn this morning from the Apostle Paul, a wise fisherman, about how to be fishers of men? So I want to share with you 4 things. One is to go where they are. When I was learning to fish this summer, one of the first things that every blog I would go to and every video that I would go to on how do you fish, everybody, the first thing they would say is, you've got to fish where there's fish. And that's kind of a little bit of a no-brainer, you would think, but it's true. You have to fish where there's fish. And we see the Apostle Paul doing this as he's a fisher of people as well. When he arrives in Athens, we're told there's two places that he goes and one place that he's taken. He first goes to the synagogue, and he walks into the synagogue to meet with people who probably have some level of understanding what the guy is talking about. At least in theory, they've read the Old Testament, they know the law, they know the prophets. They should have this ability to see the foretelling of this person that he is presenting to them as Jesus. And so Paul is going to the synagogue hoping that there's a natural connection here with the people of God, that they ought to understand that this is the fulfillment of everything that they've been hoping for. He doesn't just go where religious people are, though. It says he goes out to the marketplace, and he spends time hanging out with whoever he can hang out with. And much like our city squares today, it was a public sphere crowded with people where business and commerce took place. And there was also spots where people just kind of gathered together, and they would congregate, and they just talk, and they would share ideas. Maybe like the modern equivalent would be a bar or a coffee house, a place where people just kind of gather, and they begin to share, and they share what life is like, and they say, well, what do you think about this, and what do you think about that, and they share some ideas. And as Paul is in this spot in the marketplace, he begins to debate with some of the philosophers of Athens. And they take him to this third place called the Areopagus. Say Areopagus. Just sounds fun to say. Literally means the hill of Ares, Ares being the Greek god of war. The Romans would have called their god of war Mars, and so some people call this Mars Hill as well. That might be a little bit easier for us to say. It is formerly the Supreme Court home in Athens, but it's now just become a place where philosophers gather. And they listen to one another, and they debate with one another, and we're told in Scripture they just share ideas and sit around and talk all day. It might be a little bit like, in our context, if you ever have gone online and watched TED Talks, it might be like a place where there's TED Talks going on, or maybe a secular university setting where there's education and there's teaching and there's these ideas being shared and challenging pluralistic ideas all kind of being shared in this setting. In every place that Paul goes, he goes where people are. He goes to the place where they're likely to have the greatest understanding of his message. He goes to the places where people commonly congregate, and he goes to the places where people freely share and discuss information. If we're going to take part in the sent-out journey that Jesus invites his followers to join him on, then it means we need to go where there's fish. I noticed two camps within Christianity and within not our church per se, but the Big C church today that give me some cause for concern. One of those camps of Christians, and it's not always an age-related thing, although it skews to a little bit of an older generation or those who have been Christians for a long time, they seem to spend very little time where there's fish. In fact, for some of the people in this group, they're afraid of being in those places. They've gotten very comfortable with Jesus. They've gotten very comfortable with their own faith experience. They like church. They like Bible studies. They like prayer. But they spend little time in the world. And in fact, for many of them, as you talk to them and you listen to this group of people talk about those who are out in the world, but where the fish are, there's almost this fear of, they think differently than me. They believe differently than me. I'm not sure how to relate with them. I'm uncomfortable around people of a different background or values or morals or ideas. But focusing on our comfort rarely, if ever, leads to a successful time of catching fish. I think about a couple of weeks ago, the last time really that Christia and I went to the lake together to go literally fishing, we went with very different purposes in mind. And so we went to the lake, and Christia brought with her only a few things. She brought her pole, some hooks, a bucket, and some bait. And Christia was at the lake to fish. And so all day while we are at the lake, Christia's got her stuff with her, and she's throwing out the bait, and she's reeling in fish, and she's changing worms and pulling fish off the hook. I went to the lake that day to be comfortable. And so when I got to the lake, I had my chair, I had a bag of like snacks, and I wasn't even looking at the lake. When I first got there, I found like 2 trees, and I strung up the hammock, and I'm laying in the hammock feeling the breeze. Like I threw a bobber in the water, but I didn't really expect anything to bite what I put on the hook. I was just there to chill out and to relax. And I can tell you, we had very different results in what we caught that day going fishing. Christia caught a ton of fish, and I caught my breath. When it comes to the Jesus mission, I wonder how many Christians have hooked up the hammock and they're content to sit back and relax spiritually and hope that somebody else is fishing for them. There's another group that I see within kind of Christianity today, and honestly, this group scares me more than the hammock group. This group sometimes will look at the hammock group and they will kind of point the finger and they will say, the hammock group is a bunch of hypocrites and they need to be out there in the world and they shouldn't just be sitting in church and they shouldn't just be sticking their nose in the Bible all the time. But the problem with this group is they seem to have very little love for the things that Jesus cared about. That real connection with God. That real connection with Jesus. I mean, we only find that connection with God when we intentionally seek and pursue him. We find him in that reading of his word and that spending time in worship and prioritizing gathering together with his people. And I fear for this group that sometimes they point the finger so hard and they look at the fish so much that they've wandered over to the lake and thought, they're having more fun than they are. And they jumped in the lake and become one of the fish again and given up on the whole thing. Paul was deeply troubled when he wandered around Athens. He likely witnessed culture and architecture and experiences that he'd only heard and dreamed about before. And I'm sure as Paul wandered around Athens, it was beautiful and it blew his mind and it was attractive. But nothing could compare with the relationship he had with Jesus. And his heart broke for people who were so blinded by the beauty of life on this earth that they were in danger of missing a real connection with God the Father. He taught us that we need to go where the fish are, be where they are, and remain on the banks, fishing for others. Second thing that we can learn from the Apostle Paul is to learn how they think. This was another piece of advice I saw over and over again in fishing videos and blogs this summer, is to think like a fish. It relates from everything from where you find them to what they might eat to when they might eat it. Paul spent time in Athens learning about the people of the city and trying to learn what they were like. And when he stands up to speak in the Areopagus in verse 22, he says, I see that in every way you are very religious. And he goes on in verse 23 to explain that he's been walking around the city and he's been looking at their shrines and their altars and their religious habits. Paul wants to understand who these people are and what makes them tick and how they think before he shares with them. The way we think is often very different than the way people who we are trying to reach with the gospel think. We typically think with a different worldview or a different value system. The way we see the world is through a certain lens that is completely different than the lens that others look through. And predominantly it's in what we value, what we find important to us in life is very different than what other people might find important. In trying to catch literal fish, one of the things that always annoys me about the way they think is that fish have a value on cover. They love to be in cover, and what cover usually means is weeds, or grass, or greenery, or seaweed. And I hate cover. When I go to the lake and I throw my hook out or my lure out or whatever it is, I am always catching something green that is not a fish, pulling it up on land. And I think I wish that these fish would not value cover, but they would be in the open waters where there's nothing to catch my hook on. But we have a different value system, and if I'm going to catch fish, I have to think like a fish and be willing to deal with some of that difficulty. People in the world don't usually think the way we think. They don't usually value what we value. And they're not going to value what we value. And so we have to put some effort forth to be able to think like them. And so Paul did this by learning. What did people value? The more we understand about what someone values, the more we will know how they think. Because our line of thinking almost always follows our value system. It doesn't follow the one we might like to have or what we want others to think we have, but our thinking always follows the values we actually have. The third thing that we do in fishing is to make a connection. It's the ultimate goal. It's what we're trying to do. It's when we get a bite, to use fishing lingo, or we set the hook. And in order to get bites and hopefully land a fish, there's two things that we have to keep in mind. One of them is to offer bait that a fish might chase. Because in fishing, a fish will chase a number of things, but they won't just go after just anything you decide to throw in the lake or in the river. And if you were to go online with literal fish, you'd find there's a ton of advice on what to use for bait, depending on what fish you're after, where they're at, what time of day, what color the water is, what time of year, where the moon's at, how the water's flowing, what the water temperature is, what the bank looks like, etc., etc., etc. But it boils down to using bait that fish want to chase. And this is why it's so important to learn how fish think. And it's important in sharing the gospel as well. When Paul learned that the people of Athens were already chasing philosophy and religion, he used it to use his connection. And to paraphrase verse 23 a little bit, he tells his audience, while you value religious habits, and you will even go so far as that you don't want to overlook, you don't want to offend a God you might not know, and so you build this altar to an unknown God that you don't know, Paul says, I can tell you who that is. This God that you don't know and that you don't understand, I can tell you who he is. He finds what we might call the small t truth in their value system, and he relates it back to Jesus. In verse 28, he actually goes as far as quoting two different philosophers. He quotes Athenian philosophers that they would say, and in doing this, he redeems their worldview. If we're going to connect with people who God is after and call them to join us in pursuing them, then we're going to have to get some good bait. We're going to have to look at the people around us and think, what is it that matters to them? What is their value system? And rather than condemning everything about the people we want to reach, we say, what is good about them? Where is the image of God already present in these people? Last week we said all truth is God's truth. Where's the small t truth that is already in their life, that is God pulling them back to himself? And how can I help them understand how God is already at work in the good that is already a part of their life and connect them back to Jesus? We got to use good bait. And the good bait is going to come from what they already value that is good. And equally important to using good bait when you're fishing is whatever you do, you don't scare the fish away. I think about, again, with our family, when we go fishing, we have a young daughter who is awesome and she is full of energy, and she loves to fish for about 10 minutes. And when 10 minutes is up, she will start putting sticks into her belts, and she's like a ninja going through the forest and all kinds of like awesome stuff that she's doing. But eventually, sometimes she will decide that she wants to like run at the lake and start screaming and like throwing logs at fish. And Christy and I are like, no, there is no way we're going to catch fish with you doing that. But the truth is that sometimes as Christians, we make this fatal mistake in sharing the gospel. We wonder why nobody is interested in our bait. We might even be in the right place at the right time, thinking like a fish and using the right bait, but still scaring fish away faster than we can catch them. People, I think, are like fish in that they don't want to be attacked and they don't want to be threatened. And too often our evangelistic pursuits will do one or the other. We threaten people with hell. And we attack them with judgmental, self-righteous reasons why you're wrong and I'm right. And we may even be right. We might be correct. I mean, we do know the truth, but it's possible to be correct and still ineffective. Paul didn't stand and condemn the people of Athens. There was a lot of things that he saw when he was there that were sinful. It was probably the most sinful city Paul had ever been in. But he didn't condemn anyone. He looked at their way of life And he found what is good in these sinful, broken people who have completely missed the point of God, and they're worshiping themselves, essentially. How can I connect them back with this God who loves them, who created them, who died on a cross to know them? The fourth thing we do is we reel them in. It's the most invigorating part of fishing for literal fish, is when you actually get a fish on the line and you begin to reel it in and make an actual catch. And here again, I think there's a lot of fishing advice that relates directly to our sent out mission. For one thing, a fish is likely to resist. When you get a fish on the line and you get it hooked and you're starting to reel it in, it doesn't usually go, well, I got a hook in my mouth. Might as well just let them pull me up on the bank. All right. But a fish is going to fight, and it's going to resist, and it's going to try to swim away and pull on the hook. Some of the people, we're told in verse 32, sneer at the Apostle Paul for talking about a resurrection from the dead. And for you and I, when we share our faith and share the gospel with others, we're pretty likely to encounter resistance from those we might talk to. Some people might laugh it off, just like they did at Paul. Crazy Jesus stuff. What are you talking about? Some people might just not be ready for a commitment. Some people, again, like a fish, they might look at the bait that you're offering, and they might want to snag the bait and just run away without ever really getting hooked. One of the things that we learn with fishing for literal fish is to be slow when you're reeling it in. If you go too fast reeling a fish in, you'll rip a hook right out of its mouth, and you'll cause it to let go and get away. And similarly, sometimes in our evangelistic pursuits and sharing the gospel with others, we have this desire to get them on land as quick as possible. But if we're not careful, and if we go too fast and too hard, we cause injury. And they get away, and they're less likely to bite a hook again in the future. In verse 32, we learn that there are some people who were listening to Paul at the Areopagus, and they were curious. They were on the hook, but they weren't ready to go on the bank yet. And they said, Paul, we want you to come back. Tell us more about this Jesus and about what he means. And some of the people that we will talk to might be interested in Jesus, but we have to be willing to walk the journey with them slowly. Sometimes in fishing it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Sometimes the line snaps, or the fish gets off the hook, or it dives into cover that you can't get it out of. And in reality, when we fish for Jesus on a sent-out mission, we won't have a 100% success rate. Jesus didn't. Paul didn't. Peter didn't. You and I won't. But the truth is, a few keepers will make it all worth it. The best part of fishing is those few keepers that you get that make it all worth it. And whether they're the fish that you just kind of take that picture with and you smile and go, look what I caught, and you catch and release and let them go, or whether that's the fish that you put in the bucket and you bring home to make for dinner and provide a meal for your family, there's joy in landing the fish. And in verse 34, we learn that the Apostle Paul caught some fish while he was in Athens. Now, he didn't have the same kind of day as Peter in Acts chapter 2. Peter in Acts chapter 2 catches a couple thousand fish. Paul maybe catches a couple dozen. But there are people who come to faith. And while not everyone you talk to about Jesus will become one of his followers, not everyone will immediately connect with you or will immediately connect with our church, it's the few people who do that make it worthwhile. How can we be wise fishers of men? We go where the people are. We learn how people think, and we make a connection with what is good in them to redeem that and point them closer to Christ. We reel them in slow, walking a journey of connection with them. Let me pray for you this morning. Dear Heavenly Father, God, I thank you for those that went before me who considered me worth catching. I thank you for those who didn't just stay comfortable in the hammock, those who didn't just kind of give up on even sharing their faith and just jump in with everybody else, but they remained true to your word, and they cared about people like me enough to share their Jesus story in a way that your Spirit connected and pulled my heart to you. God, I thank you for those who are here that have at one point in time, that's been their story. They've been in the lake. They've been one of those fish that didn't know you, that wasn't connected with you, and somebody saw value in them. And God, they found the truth of who you are and what you're doing in their life. And Jesus, I pray that you would use us as a church, that you would call us, just as your first disciples, to follow you, to love you with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. But that we would also love our neighbors as ourselves. And that once we know the truth and the hope of having the connection with God our Father through Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit, that we wouldn't hoard it and keep it to ourselves and just remain comfortable and relaxed, that we wouldn't get choked out and worried by all the concerns of this world, but that we would be sent out on mission with Jesus to share the faith and the hope that we have. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.